I hope that after listening to my opening remarks, you now feel you have a better sense of the challenges posed by Manyorshu as a text of such antiquity and complexity. In this section, I'm going to present what I could term the orthodox consensus view of Manyorshu as a work displaying the evolution of Japanese poetic literature from the earliest times into the late Nara period. As I have already mentioned, there are alternate views of the anthology as something other than a purely literary project, but I don't think that these two interpretations are necessarily mutually exclusive. This is because poetry was very rarely purely literary until significantly later in Japan's history, in the sense that it was composed for a variety of social or even political purposes, and thus even if one accepts Manyorshu as a political project aimed at demonstrating the central role of the sovereign in an imperially hierarchical state, that does not necessarily mean that it cannot also display the evolution of literary technique as poets changed their ideas about what made good or bad, or appropriate and inappropriate poetry. It is also through looking at this literary evolution that we can get a better sense of the extent to which the poetry in Manyorshu was or was not influenced by continental ideas and practices. As I said before, there has been a tendency to portray it as a purely Japanese collection, free from the influence, or some might even say corruption, of Sinitic ideas, but that simply doesn't hold water if you look at it in any detail. We'll come to that in a moment, however. Put somewhat crudely, the orthodox view of Manyo poetry sees its development as a series of binary contrasts between an earlier and later stage, although it's acknowledged that there was not a sudden cut-off point or sudden change, but a process of gradual evolution with poems composed during a long-running transitional period, demonstrating the characteristics of early and later poetry to a greater or lesser degree. The first of these binary contrasts is between poetry which was primarily intended to be recited out loud and poetry where this was not the case so strongly. You'll note that I have not said poetry which was intended to be read, that is, read silently to oneself, because there is a great deal of evidence to suggest that this did not become the primary means by which poetry was consumed until significantly later. Even in the 12th century, it was more normal to read poems out loud so that their sounds could be appreciated as well as their sense. If this seems strange, remember that there are records recounting people's astonishment that the Venerable Bede, the greatest teacher and writer of early medieval England, read silently without sounding out the words as he did so. Thus, silent reading was not normal in England at this time either. In any case, scholars who support this view of early manual poetry as deriving primarily from orality link this to established folk and religious beliefs that intoning words out loud, or particular sequences of words, had real-world impact. At the heart of this was, according to scholars such as Konishi Jinichi, a belief in kotodama, a term which translates roughly as the spirit of words. Not all words necessarily had this, but particular phrases did, and including phrases such as these in poems invoked this spirit and allowed the oral recitation of these poems to have an effect on the real world, whether that be pacifying the soul of someone who had died, appealing to a deity, or improving a harvest. One interpretation sees the use of makura kotoba in manual poetry as emblematic of this. That is, makura kotoba essentially served as invocations of kotodama, and helped to ensure that the poems had the desired effect. As the force of belief in kotodama weakened toward the end of the Nara period under the influence of Buddhism, makura kotoba were reduced to being used for mere ornamental emphasis, to use Konishi's phrase, a role which they continued to play to a greater or lesser degree as they became less and less understood in later periods of waka history. As an aside, the weakening of belief in the power of kotodama didn't signify a weakening of belief in the supernatural power of spoken words. It was just that the recitation of Buddhist sutras came to play an increasingly important talismanic role in warding off ill fortune and appealing for good, something which they still do today to some extent. In parallel with this decline in the oral qualities of waka went an increase in the use of slightly more complex images of various kinds. Many of these derived, to a greater or lesser extent, from images and expressions which were current in 6th Dynasty's Chinese poetry. The Six Dynasties in Chinese history covers 400 years from approximately 200 to 600, and in itself could be the subject of in-depth study, so I don't have the time to go into it in a great deal of detail now. Suffice it to say that Six Dynasties poetry was extremely influential on later poetic developments in China, particularly in the Tang period, and also that it's clear that by the early Nara period in the 700s, literate Japanese were well aware of many of its structures, styles, terms and expressions, and that they began to incorporate these into their own work. To give a relatively crude example, one of the features of long poems, Nagauta in Manyoshu, is that they feature relatively complex parallelism, that is, complementing or contrasting images in subsequent lines or subsequent sections. So a reference to autumn might be followed by one to spring, and so forth. This type of parallelism was a key feature of much Six Dynasties poetic composition, and the argument that Japanese poets began to utilise it after they became aware of its use in Chinese poetry, rather than developing it entirely independently, is quite persuasive. Similarly, it's also the case that long poems are often followed by one or more waka, which attempt to distill the key emotions or images expressed in the longer work into a shorter form. These poems are termed hanka in Japanese, which is usually translated as envoy in English. This practice of following a longer poem with a shorter one to summarise it is also seen in Six Dynasties poetic practice, as well as in Korean works of the same period. So again, it seems likely that the usage of envoys with long poems is something which the Japanese adopted after seeing it used in continental models. The adoption, or perhaps that ought to be the adaptation, of Chinese poetic practices for use in Japan was paralleled by the adoption of images and expressions adapted from Chinese literary sources. A little while ago in one of the other videos, I gave you the entire preface to the sequence of poems composed at Otomo no Tabito's Plum Blossom Banquet in 730. This is replete with Chinese imagery and terminologies such as the references to butterflies, orchids, and perfumed sachets. It is for this reason that this particular event is often seen as a liminal moment which marked new confidence among Japanese poets in adopting Chinese terms and using them for their own purposes. One could even see this as the starting point of a decline in the prestige and composition of waka and its replacement by composition entirely in Chinese, at least for formal and official purposes. It's certainly the case that the first century of the Heian period is marked by imperial support for and promotion of composition in Chinese, and the compilation of anthologies of Chinese poetry rather than waka. And this was at least partially the result of the greater adoption by the imperial family of Chinese court practices as a way of promoting the legitimacy of their claim to rulership. For example, a number of rituals of the Chinese court involved the sovereign presenting his senior nobles and ministers with poetic topics from the throne and requiring them to compose and recite poems on them. Thus, the authority of the sovereign over the state was symbolised by his being able to require his court to compose on topics of his choosing, and this bolstered his authority as a secular ruler. A number of these rituals were adopted wholesale by the early Heian court, and thus it's not surprising that composing poetry in Chinese gained in prestige when it's what a noble had to do in order to participate in these types of rituals and stay on the emperor's good side. One can argue that it's once the court and the imperial institution gained confidence that their own indigenous practices were at least as effective at maintaining and demonstrating authority as the Chinese ones, that waka began to make a comeback, although there are, of course, other interpretations. But I digress. A final feature of the development of poetry in Manyoshu is a progression from what might be termed public to private statements, or generic expressions of emotion to personal ones. What I mean by that is that some scholars have suggested that one of the characteristics of earlier manual poetry is that even when the poems are personal ones, exchanges between lovers, for example, the emotions being expressed are conventional, meaning that they're the types of emotions that anyone in the situations being portrayed could be expected to have. To some extent, this fits relatively well with the portrayal of Manyoshu as a work emphasising the centrality of the sovereign and his or her family, in that even private poems by such exalted personages are likely to have a public character, because the writers knew that they would be read by other people as well as the intended recipients, or even possibly that the poems were written not by the named authors, but by functionaries of their courts. Thus, it is unsurprising that such works should tend towards the conventional. In later poetry, dating from the latter part of the 8th century, there is more of a focus on the poet expressing his or her personal and individual feelings. Again, the poems dating from this period are mainly, if not entirely, by poets from lower down the social hierarchy, with Otomono Yakamochi and his family and social circle being strongly represented, and such people had greater leeway to express their own individual personal feelings in verse, and less of an expectation that their works would be widely circulated, although, of course, this is what has happened in Manyoshu. You might think, well, what an imposition! I wouldn't want my private innermost feelings on display to the whole world, and I'm sure many people would share that feeling. But think about it. Isn't that just what a lot of people do these days via social media? There's a willingness among some people to live their lives in public, so to speak, publishing the most intimate details of their loves, relationships, breakups and so forth for all the world to see, or a select group within the world, friends. Although the definition of a social media friend is somewhat wider for many people than it is for others. As we have seen in the recent Wagatha Christie trial, sometimes these friends will take those intimate details and utilise them for their own purposes, which seems remarkably similar in some respects to someone taking love poetry they had exchanged with someone and publishing it in a public anthology. So it's another example of how the media may differ between the 7th and 21st centuries, but the underlying impulse is the same. Getting back to Manyoshu, some scholars portray the generalised trend towards increasingly individual expression of later Nara poetry as being emblematic of the development of the poetry of the capital. What this means is that by this time the idea of having a single fixed capital city for the Yamato state had become well established, and the nobility had become accustomed to living there. This allowed for the development of a common capital culture among the nobility, which they expressed in verse, and this was a tendency which was only to accelerate and develop further once the capital was shifted to Heian-kyo in 794. I'm aware that I have talked relatively abstractly about these divisions and differences in the poetry of the Manyoshu here, which might make some of them a bit difficult to grasp. The reason for this is that there are extensive examples of all of these differences and features by other scholars. Konishi gives a good account in the first volume of his History of Japanese Literature, and I think it will be easier for you to understand them if you can read them at leisure rather than having me go through them here. So, take a look at the literature, but before that, there's one final topic I want to mention.